What do you make of the audio that Axios released on this?
I mean, again, I think it shows what everyone already knows to be true. This was a president who clearly was in decline, which is not surprising given his age. I think that's how any of us who have grandparents probably have had conversations like that, and understand what that dynamic can be like. I think it's interesting that Republicans are talking about investigating the former president and using this to a political advantage when they spent the better part of the last 4 years whining and complaining about using the instruments of government to investigate Donald Trump and saying how unfair and unjust it is, and yet they're going to turn around and do the same thing now because it's to their political benefit, they think. I think for Democrats, the issue really isn't about Joe Biden. Joe Biden isn't why they lost the election. Like that is a convenient myth that is born out of the Washington elite circles. The Democrats lost because their brand is in the toilet, because most everyday Americans right now can't relate to the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party is associated with things like what bathroom you're going to use or who could play in what sport, rather than the everyday things that most Americans have to navigate and deal with. That's why they lost the election. Joe Biden is a convenient scapegoat. Sure, it didn't help that this was the situation. It didn't help that he had that first debate where everybody that watched that debate saw a president in clear decline that precipitated his withdrawal from that race. But the idea that if Joe Biden had not run and Democrats had been able to run whoever in a primary, that the brand issue that they have right now with voters, which to this day is why their approval rating as Democrats is still underwater, that would have materialized differently, is a complete fallacy.
A lot of Democrats, a lot of people are looking at Democrats who said, hey, he's fine, no problem, nothing to see here. And now some people are wondering if Democrats who supported Biden should apologize to the American people. Is that a narrative that is going on that you're hearing?
Yeah, I think the issue is there are certain Democrats who had direct interactions with the president who would say, hey, like, I didn't see this version of him during the conversation or meeting or appearance I had. There are some Democrats who said, yeah, he lost a step. That was pretty obvious. And then there are some Democrats who were told by those closest to the president that he was okay. And they took those people at their word. They were lied to effectively. And I think anyone who lied and who tried to downplay or underplay the true state of the president's condition, they did a tremendous disservice to the Democratic Party and to the country. And they should have known better, because what they did was make it, at the very least, easier for Donald Trump, the Republicans, to gain power and to win the election. Again, I don't believe it was the cause of why Democrats lost, but it sure as heck didn't help. And for all those Democrats who were also saying at the time, Donald Trump is the biggest existential threat to democracy that we've ever seen, this is the most important election of our lifetime, you sure as heck didn't act that way when it came to be candid about Joe Biden's mental acuity.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.